Hello. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Huang Wang. I'm the president of the Chinese American Association Lexington, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to come and join us at this very, very popular seminar. But before we get the event started, and I would like to ask people to hold a moment of silence and for Chen, and who was, of course, was the homicide victim, here in Lexington. And we had her memorial service this very morning. And so let's all hold a moment of silence in honor of her. Thank you. Thank you. And so today, actually, this event is organized by Cal, but it's really in great partnership and with both the Carey Memorial Library and the Lexington Historical Society. So here, I would like to acknowledge my co-conspirators. And so, Corinne Stanbridge, can you come up? Actually, I'd like you to come up. So she's the director of the library, and we actually scheduled this event first in the large meeting room, then we, of course, register full, and then we move this to the living room of library, and then, of course, it's over capacity. And so Corinne actually worked very hard to secure this new venue so we can have all of you come and join us. Thank you, Corinne. And I'd also like to thank, Donna and Cooper. She is the president of Lexington Historical Society. Can you stand up? So this is another partner. So this is actually sort of talk about why we have this, seminar or lecture to start with. So as we know, last month is the Asia Pacific Heritage Month. And also, last month was also the 105th anniversary, of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so we really hope to have an event during May. But as you should know, is General Chen. He's very busy during May. He actually was a guest at the Golden Spike Conference in Utah, last month. So we're very happy to have him here. And so with that, and I would like to hand the mic to Larry Ho. And so all of us know Larry and Sophia. So they are probably the people who lead the Lexington minority community the earliest to hear. And they really have been the ones, put the Chinese Americans really on map here in Lexington. And I personally came here because Sophia told me to. And never say no to Sophia. And so we moved here because of that. So then I'll hand it to Larry, and Larry will introduce General Chen.
Good afternoon. And usually when you introduce somebody, you start with sentences. It's my high honor and distinct privilege to, in fact, even apply to the President of the United States. And it's used so often that someone becomes a cliche. But in this case, I honestly would say, both passion and respect, that this is absolutely appropriate. If, the Chinese Americans, Chinese first immigrated to the United States about 170 years ago, as Huang mentioned, to build railroad. Of course, in the famous photograph 150 years ago, they were partly excluded from the picture, but been easily rectified. Our speaker today, really my family lineage and his own accomplishment, is uniquely qualified to talk about the history of Chinese American immigration and accomplishment in the United States. I just sort of a quick title, which he will explain. And if you go Google today on the internet, you'll find 360,000 pages about our speaker. And if I start going through that, it will take more than 2 hours. So I'm not going to do this. But I will mention, as a matter of personal privilege and pride, subject that's not in the 360,000 pages. He and I both belong to a small but worldwide fraternity of service, both public and private. So I am really have a distinct high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to you the speaker, Major General Bill Chen, and my fraternity brother.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I want to also particularly thank Cal and the Lexington Historical Society, as well as the library, for making this event possible. Now, I've been known to be inscrutable, and that's exactly why I chose the title Written as Is, because Chinese and Chinese Americans here in the United States have been characterized as obscure, vague, and inscrutable. Next part. And so, of course, the real title is as shown here. The opening of opportunities by Chinese and Chinese Americans, in particular Chinese railroad workers, based upon building the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Chinese American veterans of World War II. Next. This is an outline of my presentation. I'm not a historian, but I'll talk about the two major contributions of Chinese Americans here in the United States. I'll talk about what they did, the opening of opportunities, and then I'll tell a few stories. And the stories deal with 3 Chinese railroad workers and their direct descendants. And it so happened that the 3 descendants, who all are American born, happened to serve in the 14th Air Force in the China-Burma India Theater under the command of General Claire Chennault of the legendary Flying Tigers. I'll continue by making some observations. The epilogue, I hope, will be of interest to you, and I'll wind up with a vision for all of you. Now, by request, I was asked to talk a little bit more about myself, and so I have an adjunct to this presentation that will highlight my views on leadership and career development. Okay, the 2 major contributions of Chinese Americans in our history up to World War II. Number 1 is building the Transcontinental Railroad. Number 2 is the Chinese American veterans of World War II. Now, May 10th, 1869 was the celebration of the joining of the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. And so we had the Central Pacific Railroad going from Sacramento east, and then the Union Pacific Railroad from Council Bluffs, Iowa, west. And so May 10th, 1969 was the 100th anniversary. Now, what happened there were 2 things. One is the Secretary of Transportation at that time made recurring statements, words to the effect that only Americans could have done such and such on the railroad as shown here, without mentioning the Chinese railroad workers. And so I have 3 symbols at the end of his quotes, and all of you can make up your mind on what those symbols mean. For example, was it ignorance? Did he not know that there were Chinese that built the railroad from west to east, the Central Pacific Railroad that had 90% Chinese in their workforce? Or did he know, but then what? He excluded them. And was that by design or by intent? I don't know. Now, the third bullet could mean what? Perhaps a little insulting. Now, the other event that occurred at the 100th anniversary is the president of the Chinese History Society of America, based in San Francisco, was scheduled to speak. He also had a plaque for presentation. But what happened? He was snubbed. Now, another word I could have used was he was scrubbed from the agenda. So how disappointing would that be at the 100th anniversary? Okay. We had the 150th anniversary in May of this year. My wife Sandra and I were there, and I can tell you that all the speakers gave honor and respect to the Chinese railroad workers. The Secretary of Transportation, gave honor to the Chinese railroad workers as well as to all the other railroad workers, the Irish, the Germans, blacks, Mormons, and Native Americans. So I think we could say that we have completed the arc that started with the Chinese railroad workers coming to work on the railroad. Then, in spite of some snubbing, we had at that event a speaker that is a descendant of the Chinese railroad workers, which recapped the history and the deeds and accomplishments of the Chinese railroad workers. So we have now completed that arc. Now, how about World War II? World War II effectively ended with the surrender of the Japanese in September 1945. So that's 73, 74 years ago. The key aspect of Chinese American veterans in World War II was not necessarily acts of bravery or heroism, but the fact that they volunteered and they served in spite of the discriminatory aspects of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was not repealed until December 17, 1943. I was involved in making the rounds of Congress on the House side and the Senate side to get co-sponsors for the bills for the award of the Congressional Gold Medal to Chinese American veterans of World War II. And in that process, one of the key points I tried to make was this is a bipartisan effort, and we need to have this accomplished by December of last year, and prior to the anniversary, the 75th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Unfortunately, the bill was not enacted until December 20th. So we missed that date, but still it was passed into law. And so what we can see is recognition of progress has been slow. Next chart. Okay, let me now talk about accomplishments of the Chinese railroad workers. Basically, the Transcontinental Railroad was started by President Lincoln, in fact, before the Civil War. And so work, of course, was interrupted because of the Civil War, and then, of course, restarted afterwards. Roughly 90% of the workers on the Central Pacific Railroad were Chinese. And so in terms of their accomplishments, they had the more tougher route going from west to east compared to east to west, because they had to cut through the Sierra Nevada mountains. This meant working in the snow, 20 inches, 30 inches in the snow. This meant boring through tunnels where the labor was really done by hand. And so they accomplished that, and they got to Promontory Point, which is where the railroads met. Now, in terms of recognition, as I mentioned, its progress has been slow. They were forgotten. There's an iconic picture taken May 10th, 1869, that shows the railroad leaders and other workers, but no Chinese faces were shown in that picture. Now, Stanford University has done a research project on Chinese railroad workers, and after a more thorough look at that same picture, they think that there were 2 Chinese railroad workers in that iconic photo, but the backs were turned. They were able to discern that they were likely Chinese railroad workers based upon the dress that they had. Okay, so how do we look upon this? It's good to see the younger generation here, because this is really a part of Chinese-American pioneering efforts, our Chinese-American history, heritage, and a legacy of progress. Now, ideally, the way to look at that should not be by my words there that have Chinese Americans. Because what we should be able to say is, this is American heritage. This is our American history. And so let's go on. Next. Okay. In terms of opening of opportunities, when the railroad was built, it effectively linked east and west. So that's the Pacific to the Atlantic and vice versa. It increased trade, commerce, business. It opened up opportunities for all Americans, as well as for Chinese Americans. Another aspect is that in opening up the railroads from a people-to-people standpoint, there was an opportunity for the peoples to get to know each other and start the aspects of settlements, where we have side-by-side different settlements of all nationalities. So when we look at this, we should look at all of this as a part of our legacy of progress. Okay, now to the achievements of the Chinese American veterans. What I have in the first bullet are a series of different awards and decorations that they received, starting with the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Navy Cross, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star Medal, Air Medal, and also the Combat Infantry Badge and Combat Medical Badge. Do we have any U.S. Navy veterans in the audience? Okay. The most distinguished, in my opinion, Chinese-American naval officer was a Rear Admiral Gordon Paea Chung Hong. And during World War II, he was a commander of a ship. And he won the Navy Cross and the Silver Star. And then he was in the Korean War, and later on was promoted to Admiral, and the first flag rank officer in the Navy of of Chinese origin. Okay, the other aspect that is different of Chinese Americans serving in World War II compared to Japanese Americans, and for the most part, Black Americans, were the Chinese Americans, probably over 90%, were integrated into the U.S. Armed Forces. So they served side by side with all other Americans. The Japanese Americans, for example, are famous for their unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Battalion, but they were all Japanese American, all Nisei units. Now, the Chinese Americans did have an all Chinese American organization unit that was called the 14th Air Service Group, that was a part of the 14th Air Force under General Chennault. Now, those of you that have studied World War II, you've probably heard of General Chennault of the Flying Tigers in the Army Air Force. You probably have heard of General Stilwell, U.S. Army, who was the commander of the China-Burma India Theater. Now, General Chennault and General Stilwell didn't get along. But my understanding is it was based upon an agreement on the need where they agreed that we should have Chinese Americans who had some language background and could speak Chinese to form an all-American unit to come and serve in the China-Burma India Theater. So, history-wise, perhaps we can say there's at least one area of agreement that happened between General Chennault and General Stilwell. But the most important thing of the service of the Chinese American veterans is that they had volunteered and they served in spite of the discriminatory aspects of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the bottom statement in red is an actual quote from the act that awards the Congressional Gold Medal to Chinese American veterans of World War II. Next. Okay, so what are the accomplishments? I think we need to understand what the conditions were and what the life situation was of Chinese in America prior to World War II. They were in Chinatowns across the country. They were mostly isolated themselves. Some of them were in rural areas, for example, doing some farming, but largely they were isolated and they were not known to the general American public until service in World War II. So in terms of accomplishments, what we can say is they made known to the American public the abilities and capabilities of Chinese Americans. They paved the way for follow-on generations to be a part of mainstream America, and that's what happened post-World War II. And it's also then a continuation of the legacy of progress that began with the Chinese railroad workers. Next one. Okay, this, to my knowledge, is the latest passing of a Chinese American veteran of World War II, and that was last month. The in memoriam here was written by his daughter. And when you read that, you can see from the words the perspective of proud to serve, the accomplishments made, and then for the follow-on generations, how, having served in World War II, he was able to make use of the GI Bill to get an education, bring up his families, and in this case, 5 daughters that all graduated from college. And so I think the last line is particularly important, where he makes the statement that he made friends with people of all races, and he was a bit, and he had a bigger life and and saw greater possibilities. Now, the other thing you can do is wipe out the name that's shown and blank out the picture that is shown. What does this really convey? It really conveys Americans and their experience in World War II. Now, we know that our veterans of World War II constitute the greatest generation. And I know a number of you have probably read that book by Tom Brocroft. But it goes back to my earlier statement of obscurity, for perhaps forgotten or not known, that when we hear about the greatest generation, we seldom or never see that the meaning of that applies to Chinese Americans. Next. Okay, I'd now like to talk about 3 Chinese railroad workers. 2 of them worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. The third worked on the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Southern Pacific Railroad went from California to El Paso, Texas. So that's later than the 1869 date of the first transcontinental railroad. And then I'll talk about the 3 descendants who were all Americans, all American born, and they all served in the 14th Air Force. Now, 2 of them were in the Army Air Force, and strangely, one of them, even though he was born in the U.S., joined the Chinese Air Force, and I'll talk about that later. So these relate to my 2 major contributions, and hopefully when you hear the stories, you'll get some personal aspects that deal with the human dimension of our Chinese Americans. Next. Okay, what impressed me most with the first 2 is that they were foremen and labor contractors. This meant that they had good knowledge of English in order to deal with the American supervisors and managers of the railroad. At the same time, they were supervisors and leaders of Chinese railroad workers, so they had leadership skills. In the third case, he was a letter writer. And so if you can imagine Chinese railroad workers working here in the United States, fortunately, in their off time, they could talk to the letter writer. The letter writer would write letters, send them home, and then when the letters came back, to be able to pass that on to the Chinese railroad workers. Now, to the right, you'll see in black the different locations where they came from. They all came from Guangdong province. First one, Dongguan. Second one, Zhongshan. Third one, Huiping, or Kaiping. And so these were areas where there was flooding, there was famine, and the bulk of the initial Chinese immigrants to the United States that either came for gold or came for the railroads were from those areas. The one district that's not mentioned is Toisan, and you probably heard about Chinese immigrants from Toisan. Now, after the railroad was completed, Chen Min-su was in mining, and he settled in California. But the most important and key aspect of his accomplishment was he was recognized by the state of Colorado as a pioneer and memorialized as such in the State House, in the Central City Opera House, and so that's quite an accomplishment. Now, fortunately, he was able to bring his wife from China, and so they started a life in Colorado, And their daughter, her name is Lily, was the first recorded American-born Chinese in Colorado. In the case of Jim King, he continued as a labor contractor, and I don't know whether many of you have been to the Sacramento area, but they have what's called the Sacramento Delta. And so Jim King led a group of Chinese laborers in building the levees there in Sacramento. And he was able to meet his wife from San Francisco. His son, his name was Willie, was the unofficial mayor of Denver, Chinatown. Okay, the third Chinese railroad worker happens to be my grandfather. When the railroad was finished in El Paso, Texas, the workers were released, and so they scattered. Some of them went back to California, others went back to China. My grandfather migrated to Mississippi and got into the grocery business. Now, apparently he did well enough, and just visualize that time period prior to 1900. He then made a trip to New York City, and through a matchmaker, met my grandmother. So then they came back to Mississippi. But unfortunately, there were some racial tensions in Mississippi. They kind of lost everything, and they migrated to Ohio, and that's where my father was born. And that's where his other older brothers and younger brothers were born. Okay, so what we have here then is the beginning of Chinese railroad workers settling in different parts of the United States. Next. Okay, the first one I'm going to talk about is W.C. Chen. Now, he was in communications and was a communications officer for the 23rd Fighter Group of the 14th Air Force. And when you think about it today, when everybody is talking about communications and cryptography and whatnot, that's a significant responsibility to be a communications and crypto officer in a fighter group for the United States Army. Now, he settled back in the Denver area, and he formed up a Cathay post of the American Legion. And he was very proud of his service in World War II. And in his last days, whenever he went out, he always wore on one side of his coat a lapel with the American flag, and the other lapel was the Flying Tigers. Next. Okay, here's Bill King. In 1939, he wanted to join the Army Air Force. In those days, it was called the Army Air Corps. But he was denied because of race. Now, in those days, and this is during the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinatown in San Francisco would sponsor groups where volunteers would volunteer to go to China to fight. He did receive some flight training here in the U.S., but then he joined the Air Force Academy in China and became a part of the Chinese Air Force. He was a fighter pilot flying P-40s and the P-51. He was part of what was known as the Chinese-American Composite Wing of the 14th Air Force. Now, the meaning of Chinese-American Composite Wing was not a mixed wing that involved Americans of Chinese descent. It was rather Chinese Air Force and American Air Force merged into a wing. And so if it was a bomber aircraft, they would have a mixed crew. Some American Air Force, some Chinese Air Force. If it was a single engine aircraft, like a P-40 or a P-41, then they were separate Chinese Air Force pilots flying with American pilots, but they were fighting together side by side. So he had a distinguished career. He won and was awarded 3 distinguished flying crosses. This is U.S. Distinguished Flying Crosses. And then later on, he returned to California and he worked for General Mills. But let me make a comment. You heard me talking about the Congressional Gold Medal and the Chinese Americans of World War II, where veterans of U.S. military services would be awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. In this situation, what do we do of an American-born Chinese who served in the Chinese Air Force? Is he qualified? The question to ask is, was he granted U.S. veteran status? The answer is no. Was he granted equivalent service in the U.S. Armed Forces? No. So, unfortunately, in his case, he will not be a recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal. Okay, this is my father, Chen. He graduated from the University of Michigan in 1932 with a degree in aeronautical engineering. But in those days, it was the Depression, and in those days, the 1932 time period, aircraft companies were not hiring Orientals. But he had a passion for aviation, and he saved up enough money to take flying lessons at Roosevelt Field in Long Island, New York, got his commercial pilot's license. He flew for the U.S. Mail Service, and visualize this. In those days, it was open cockpit biplanes, 2 wings, open cockpit, and he flew for the U.S. Mail Service. But then in 1935, he went to China to work for an airline called CNAC, which was partially owned by Pan American Airways. And then he worked for a company called Camco, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. The president of Camco was William Pauley, who was also the representative for Curtiss-Wright Corporation in China. Curtiss-Wright Corporation manufactured the P-40s. And so the American Volunteer Group, headed by Claire Chennault as a civilian, used P-40s. And so when the American Volunteer Group was approved, they came to China and they were employees of Camco. And of course this was a guise because we didn't want to tell the Japanese that all these pilots were coming. They were coming as employees of Camco, and they had various professions, like I'm a farmer or whatever. So Camco supported the first American volunteer group that became known as the Flying Tigers. And in the case of my father, after Pearl Harbor, he joined the Army Air Corps. Now, in his case, joining the Army Air Corps was not a problem because when he was at the University of Michigan, like many other states, have land-grant colleges, and so he had taken ROTC, and so being integrated was relatively easy. Okay, later on, after being with General Chennault in the 14th Air Force, he worked for the airline that General Chennault founded post-World War II. And later on, he worked for Northrop Aircraft Company. And so in his case, he completed his arc where he graduated as an aeronautical engineer, could not work for an aircraft company, joined the military, and then post-World War II, he was able to join Northrop Aircraft Company as a manager. Next. Okay, here I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, and the picture on the right is me at age 4, and then me later on as Major General. Now, I have 4 titles on this chart, and all 4 titles apply. So, the spirit of World War II. Now, who dresses a 4-year-old? Right? My mother. So my mother was the spouse of an officer in the U.S. Army Air Force, and so she dresses me up in uniform. That's why I call this the spirit of World War II. Okay, the other one is living our dreams. Well, how do you transform from the kid on the left to the person on the right? It's a combination of a lot of things. Hard work, ambition, living your dreams, being lucky, etc. And so I like that title as well. But the best title I like is the next one, Only in America. I was a keynote speaker at the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad for the opening ceremony. And included in one of my charts was this one, where I said, only in America could a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker become a major general. Now, let me tell you what I also said at the 150th anniversary session as a vision for the near future. And that is, how would it be if 50 years from now we would have a speaker that would be able to say, only in America could a descendant of a Chinese railroad worker become the President of the United States. Okay, here's a picture of me greeting President Bush. Next chart. Okay, this chart wraps up a little bit about my family. And of course, on the upper left is my father as the first generation in the United States. And then the second generation is an older brother and a younger brother. All 3 of us saw military service. And then the next generation down, we have Debbie, who is my younger brother Moon's daughter, and she's currently a major, a helicopter pilot in the United States Army, and having served in Iraq, and Afghanistan. Okay, what are some observations that we can make? We know that our forefathers incurred sacrifices, there was hard work, there was risk of life. But they had their deeds and accomplishments. And then in the case of our World War II veterans, they demonstrated the skills, the competencies, loyalty, and patriotism. And they paved the way for follow-on generations. They opened up opportunities for Chinese Americans and Asian Americans to be part of mainstream America. Next. Okay. Here's where many of you can play a part. What we have seen is in successive waves of immigration, and I'm not a history major, so maybe my waves are a little bit off, but we've had different waves of immigration of Chinese to the United States. Immediately after World War II, after the China mainland was lost. Then we saw in the early 1960s an influx of immigration, mostly from the Republic of China, where they studied and they were all graduate students, so they got PhDs. And then after China was open, a wave of immigration of students, maybe some of you are a part of that then have settled here in the United States. Meanwhile, what we see is the ascendancy of Chinese Americans, where there are Nobel Prize winners, members of Congress, there are cabinet members. We've had a Chinese American governor. We have mayors and judges. There's academia where there are presidents of universities, heads of engineering departments and other departments, actors, musicians, architects, CEOs, etc. And so it's all a part of a legacy of progress. But why is this happening? It's because of the opportunities, the freedom that we enjoy. That's part of being Americans. Next. Okay, so here's what I first started out with, but how many of you here get help from your spouses? Okay? My wife saw this and, of course, said, that's not good enough. Okay? A lot of you know, next chart, I.M. Pei, who recently passed away. How did the New York Times, the Boston Globe, characterize I.M. Pei? They did not say that he was a great Chinese-American architect. What they said is I.M. Pei is the most prominent American architect of his generation. And so that's the kind of vision and goal that I'd like to leave with you. So it's not just good enough that only in America that you can be such and such, that you should strive to be characterized as the most prominent American, and to keep in mind that you are Americans. Okay, I'm going to now very quickly transition to a couple of comments on my views on leadership and career development. Okay, summarized here are my views, and if you focus on the bottom, I can tell you that I'm basically a very quiet guy. Quiet, reticent, and many of you have probably heard of Myers-Briggs, right? They evaluate you and they tell you whether you're extrovert or introvert. I'm an introvert. So, by the same token, you've heard that leaders are born. Well, that's great, but unfortunately not all of us can be in that category. So, if you want to be a leader, you have to go on a leadership journey. And many of you will read this and you'll say, oh, that's just motherhood. Or this is so basic. Well, if everybody thinks it's so basic, then let's practice this. Let's implement this so that all of us can be great leaders. Now, let me focus on the last bullet. What do I mean by that? You need to blend in while standing out. Well, does that really make any sense? Because, you know, if a person of color like me already stands out, and when I went through grades K through 12 and most of my college, for the most part, I was the only Chinese or Asian in the classroom. When I was in the Army, in my immediate chain of command, there were no superiors that were Chinese Americans. no contemporaries, no subordinates. And so you, if you have the same skin color as me, you will stand out automatically. Therefore, you will be noticed. You will be evaluated and assessed. And therefore, that should give you the motivation, the drive, to make sure that if you're called upon in class, that you give a good answer. If you're in an audience like this, you ask a good penetrating question, because the others around you will recognize that and know that, because you stand out automatically, but you might as well excel when you stand out. Next chart. Okay, this is not a template. This is not a template on career progression or career development. There's no such thing as a template, because everybody will experience different things. And so there'll be different factors, like early on influences. There will be passion and interest. There will be aspiring for a goal. And then you attempt to do that, and then maybe you reach a certain higher level and you aspire for more. And then the last ellipse there is meant to be, you're at the stage where you have matured and perhaps you can go into a mentoring mode or help others. Okay, so everybody will have their own experiences. This is what I went through. Early on, of course, my father was in military service. He had many friends that were in military service. So early on, I decided that if there's a war, I wanted to be an officer. And so when I entered college, I wanted to join ROTC. Okay, so how did I develop an interest in missiles and rockets? Well, in 1957, I was a sophomore. Sputnik 1 was the first satellite around the world launched by the Soviet Union. It wasn't until January of 1958 that the United States launched the Explorer 1 satellite. Now, I found out, reading the news, that the rocket used to boost and send up the satellite was the Jupiter Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile from the United States Army. And the Explorer 1 was really under the leadership of Dr. Werner von Braun, who at that time was an employee of the United States Army at the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. Now, in those days, they didn't have Google. You know, today you could all Google something and find out everything you need to know. I had to go to magazines, books, and libraries to read about what the Army's role was in missiles and rockets. And so that's how I got involved in missiles and rockets. Early on, I had an assignment in a project manager's office. I was a lieutenant at that time, and we were shooting missiles with other missiles. It was an early experiment in anti-ballistic missile defense, and they put me in charge of flight testing. And so I got involved in coordinating all of that, and that piqued my interest to be a project manager, where the normal grade is a colonel, and then that project manages usually a prime contractor that is on the industry side. So you kind of follow all of that. Next chart. And this kind of wraps it up in terms of recurring assignments that I had in missiles, research and development, and project management. At the same time, the Army wants its officers to be broad. That means if a war is going on, in spite of whatever you might be doing on missiles and rockets back home, they send you off or you volunteer to go to Vietnam. In my case, I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I volunteered to go to Laos. But that's all part of the career development and building. And so this is my career progression. At this time, this completes my presentation. And I'd like to open it up to questions and answers.